Welcome everyone. I'm Chris Miller, professor at the Fletcher School and co-director of the Russia and Eurasia Program at this school. Very excited to welcome you all to this webinar, and we're very pleased to welcome back one of Fletcher's own alums, James Mackey, to join us today. Our plan today is to turn over the floor to James for some opening remarks. Then I'll ask him a couple of follow-up questions, and then in the second half of our hour together, turn it over to the audience for questions that you have. So please, as James begins his remarks, start thinking of questions, and you can either put questions as they come in the chat box, or I'll be able to call on you if you raise your hand during the second part of our time together. But with no further ado, I'd like to dive into our conversation. As an introduction, although I know we've circulated his bio around, James is the Director of Security Policy and Partnerships in the Political Affairs and Security Policy Division at NATO Headquarters, and dialing in today from NATO Headquarters, as I understand. This is obviously a point of change and flux for NATO, given the war underway between Russia and Ukraine. And so what we're hoping to discuss today is what impact this has on NATO and how it will change how NATO operates in the future. So James, I'll turn over the floor to you. Looking forward to hearing your comments and the discussion afterwards. Thank you for joining us.
Professor Miller, thanks very much. I appreciate you inviting me, and I only wish it were under a little bit better circumstances. I feel like sometimes at Fletcher, you only really get to talk to alums when there's a crisis in their field of work. But as I said, it's always a pleasure to be back with the Fletcher community. I want to talk today about sort of break my talk down into three parts. The first is how we got here. Then a little bit about where are we at this moment in time right now, and then a few thoughts about where we might be headed and what the future looks like. I'm going to focus very much on NATO and NATO's response to the attack on Ukraine. To be honest, entire books are going to be written on what has happened in the last few weeks, and whole courses at Fletcher will be designed around trying to explain what is happening right now. And I know that you just had a panel of faculty yesterday talking about the conflict. And I know better than to try and compete with the Fletcher faculty on an analysis of Russia. So let me instead try and give you a snapshot of what the invasion looks like from a NATO headquarters perspective. First, how did we get here? I think really the immediate crisis, or this crisis, begins in 2014 when Russia illegally annexed the Crimea region of Ukraine and incited a conflict in the Donbas region. This was a watershed moment for both Ukraine and for NATO. For the Ukrainians, it was a clear wake-up call. I mean, obviously, part of their territory was seized. They've worked extremely hard in the last 8 years to try and improve their defensive capabilities. And we're seeing the results of that in the way in which Ukrainian forces have been able to blunt the Russian advance up to now. But even knowing that they have been prepared, I think it's clear that the determination and the courage of the Ukrainian people is pretty breathtaking. And I think we've seen widespread international support over the last week in terms of being in favor or really strongly supportive of the Ukrainians defending their homeland. For NATO, on the other hand, at 2014, that was also a wake-up call. I think we got a real clear sense that Putin's regime was willing to use force to change international borders, and that the regime had also become quite proficient at cyber attacks and hybrid tactics. So NATO completely overhauled its plans for the defense of Europe. We improved the readiness of our forces and the ability to provide more reinforcements. We also improved our counter cyber and counter hybrid capabilities, and we increased the presence of our forces in the east of the alliance. But I think we need to put this into context a little bit in proportion. In the last few years, NATO has stationed 1,000 troops each in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. And as we've seen over the past several months, Russia has regularly moved more than 200,000 troops up to NATO's border. Russia has also regularly conducted military exercises where it simulates a nuclear attack on NATO allies. So we really need to ask who's threatening whom here, and not buy into the Russian propaganda about some great threat to Russia coming from NATO. Last autumn, we received some very solid intelligence that Russia was planning an invasion of Ukraine. Our allies with the United States in particular made a lot of this intelligence public in order to try and deter a Russian attack. And I think whole books are going to be written just on this tactic alone of the use of public release of intelligence in order to try and influence or influence a state or deter an attack. Given that we saw this coming from a long way out, we gave Putin many off-ramps. Both the US and NATO. We provided detailed responses to Russia's alleged grievances. We offered talks to address their supposed security concerns. We provided detailed proposals on arms control measures, on transparency of exercises, and a whole bunch of other steps that we could take to make everyone in Europe safer, NATO and Russia. But to be honest, it's pretty clear now that Putin was never interested in diplomacy. And we need to ensure that the sanctions bite hard and to try and convince the rulers of Russia to end this war and to pull back their troops. We need to continue to show them that continuing Putin's war, which is what I think we should call it, Putin's war, will leave Russia poorer, more isolated, and more underdeveloped for years to come. In talking about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I think we should be very direct about what we're talking about here. We're seeing an independent, peaceful, democratic country being dismantled and its people killed because of their system of government and because of their free choice. And this, to be honest, it represents a threat to the autocratic regime in Moscow. It is democracy that threatens the Russian regime and not NATO or the Ukrainian armed forces. Fortunately, most of the world has not bought into Russian propaganda on this. And we saw yesterday in the UN General Assembly, 141 states vote to condemn the invasion and calling for an immediate ceasefire. So that's sort of where we got to this point today. Now, let me talk a little bit about where we are at this moment in time. We've all been transfixed by the bravery of the Ukrainian people and what they've had to endure already. In the past week, the NATO allies have stepped up their support to Ukraine with additional military equipment, financial assistance to try and stabilize the economy, and humanitarian aid, including medical supplies to help Ukrainian forces. We're going to continue to do that and so that we can support the Ukrainian people in carrying out their right of self-defense, which is guaranteed under the UN Charter. We've also taken a number of steps to ensure that we are able to provide humanitarian support to the now more than 1 million refugees that have been caused by this conflict. The national authorities in places like Poland and Romania have been doing extremely well so far under pretty difficult circumstances. The European Union is also playing a very big role here as well as the second responder. And NATO's coordinating very closely with the EU to make sure that the refugees are safe and the national authorities can handle this influx. Now, on the NATO side, for our part, we've taken a number of steps to ensure that Russia's attack on Ukraine does not become an attack on NATO. And as I said, we need to ensure that we fulfill our core task, which is to protect the 1 billion citizens who are members of the NATO alliance. And so, as I said, just to repeat again, our steps now are aimed at ensuring that Russia's attack on Ukraine does not become an attack on NATO. So on the morning of Russia's invasion, NATO allies activated the full set of NATO's defensive plans across the entire eastern border of NATO, all the way from Norway down to Turkey. We have over 100 jets now on high alert, and we have more than 120 allied ships at sea. We've also activated for the first time the NATO response force in a defensive capacity to make sure that we have troops on standby should we need to reinforce any of the allies. We're doing this to ensure that there is no misunderstanding or miscalculation by Russia. We will continue to take all the necessary measures we need to ensure the security of the alliance. The steps we have taken are measured and proportional. And again, the numbers are much lower than what we're seeing on the Russian side of the border. The coming weeks are going to be difficult. There's no two ways about it. As has been reported in the media, the change in the Russian tactics in recent days is likely to see a substantial increase in civilian casualties. I can understand certainly the urgency behind the calls for NATO to impose a no-fly zone or to enter the conflict on Ukraine's behalf. But that immediately turns this from a Russian invasion of Ukraine into a Russia-NATO conflict with nuclear weapons on both sides. I have no hesitation at all in telling you that this is probably the hardest, one of the hardest, if not the hardest situation I've ever faced in my professional career in terms of wanting to be able to help, but also understanding the bigger picture of what that help would mean. So that's where we are right now. Now, where might we be headed in the future? I wish I had the crystal ball. I wish I had the answer. We need to keep up the pressure on Putin and his inner circle through sanctions. We need to hope that the Russian people and the Russian armed forces realize that a war of choice does not enhance Russia's security, just as it only ensures the security of Putin and his inner circle. I think that that pressure that we put from the outside and the determination of the Ukrainian people to defend their country are our best hope right now for getting a ceasefire and ending the killing. In the days and weeks ahead, we will also have an enormous amount of work to do, not just at NATO, but all of us as citizens of democratic nations, if we want to keep our peace and prosperity, because we need to be clear that the peace and prosperity of all of us is under challenge here by a state which is trying to violate international law. We need to think about what all of this means for the United Nations and the UN Security Council, the OSCE, and all of the arms control agreements that have kept peace and stability in Europe for many, many decades, including protecting Russia's security. As I said at the beginning, there will be many books written on this and many Fletcher courses that we need to think all of this through. For NATO, we've already seen some pretty significant changes. We've put our defensive plans into operation for the first time, validating the work that we've done over the last 8 years. Germany has announced a dramatic increase in its defense budget. Will meet the NATO 2% standard immediately. We will also see a substantial increase in NATO's force presence in the east of our alliance. This is exactly what Russia has said that it does not want. But it is an inevitable result of Putin's actions. We will need to station more forces in the east of our alliance to defend our security. We must be ready. At the end of the day, that's where I would end up on Russia and Ukraine. Professor Miller also asked me at the end of my talk to address a topic which is also of great concern to Fletcher students, and that is jobs. And so I know it's a bit of a disconnect, but I do think it's good at least to talk to you about conflict that you're very interested in, but also thinking about a career in international security. I work in NATO's political affairs division, which is sort of like NATO's foreign ministry. And I have to say that it is about as great a career as I could have imagined when I was at Fletcher. I did negotiation and conflict resolution and also security studies at Fletcher, and the work that I do now sort of matches those two things together. In terms of advice and thinking about the way forward, a couple things that I think would be good for Fletcher students to think about. First is language skills. If you speak Russian, Chinese, or Arabic, we want to hear from you. Those are skill sets that are always in critically short supply. One thing that you can also really work on, and Fletcher certainly helps with this, is writing skills. We need people who can write clearly, accurately and can take very complex ideas and make them easily digestible. When we write a memo to the Secretary General of NATO, we usually get 1 page or a page and a half. And you have to try and explain something like the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict or the conflict in Yemen in a page and a half. And so you need to be able to distill really complex ideas down to their essential elements. I also think that thinking skills are really important. And I know everyone says that, obviously you need to be a thinker, but we almost don't know every day what we're going to get hit with when we come into the office. And you need to be able to adapt extremely quickly. So what we have is we have people who have some regional expertise or knowledge, but what we really have much more of is problem solvers. People who can sort of tackle a problem proactively and sort of address it. I will tell you that the Fletcher degree is fantastic for that because it is not an area studies degree. So your investment of time and money in Fletcher is very well spent. And then finally, you need to get lucky. I wish I didn't have to say this, but there has to be a position open that fits your skill set at the right time. Now, you can help luck to find you by building your skill set and doing the right internships and pursuing the right path. But at the end of the day, it's a civil service organization like any, and you have to make sure that you get the position. The position that fits your skill set has to come open at the right time. We have a pretty strong Fletcher core here. My fellow director within the political affairs division, she's the director for arms control and disarmament. She is also a Fletcher grad, and actually we graduated the same year. So it's funny, our two careers went separate, and now we've sort of come back together here as the two directors within the political affairs division. But we probably have about 15 or 20 people, Fletcher alums. So let me finish up there and look forward to a lively conversation. Thanks, Chris.
Great. Well, thank you, James, for those comments. I think that gives us a whole lot to dig into, probably far more than we can cover in just 1 hour. But let me start by asking you a couple of questions. And the first is on, you mentioned the risk that the Russian invasion of Ukraine turns into and escalates into some sort of broader conflict. And I'd be interested to hear a bit more about how NATO is trying to manage that risk, because it strikes me there's probably a bit of a balancing act going on. On the one hand, a desire to signal strength and capability to defend NATO's borders. On the other hand, a desire to message to Russia that NATO is not going to push too hard in ways that might cross Russia's red lines, whatever those might be. So can you walk us through what that balancing act looks like in practice?
Sure. I mean, this is sort of classic deterrence theory, but it's much more complicated. In some ways, I mean, nuclear deterrence is actually a little bit easier because of mutually assured destruction. But when you're talking about conventional warfare, but we do also talk about deterrent effect there. And so what we're trying to clearly signal, and we, to be honest, have signaled this right from the start, is that Ukraine is not a member of NATO. It is a member of the international community, and we need to do everything we can within the UN Charter to help. But we have clearly signaled that NATO will not be sending forces into Ukraine. Anyway, it tugs at the heartstrings, but it is where we are. Ukraine does not have the Article 5 guarantee. And at the same time, I think we need to be very, very clear, as I said, that NATO is ready to defend its allies. And so what we've done is, so I mentioned we had the 4,000 forces. Again, those weren't there prior to 2014, but since 2014, we stationed 4,000 forces, 1,000 each in the Balts and Poland. And then what we've seen as we saw the risk escalate over the last couple of months with the intelligence reports, we put more forces forward into the Eastern allies. But again, very proportional. I would say that our total forces now, if we're talking about ground forces, we're probably looking in the nature of 20,000 or 25,000. And that's nowhere near the 200,000+ that Russia has on its side of the border. So 20,000 soldiers on the NATO side, but the difference is that the NATO forces, of course, are not just Latvian, they're not just Romanian, they're American, they're French, they're German, they're Canadian. And so the point is that Russia needs to be under no illusion that if it picks a fight with one of the NATO allies, if it expands the conflict, it will have a conflict with all of NATO. And so that's sort of how we're trying to signal it. We're trying to be proportional. We're trying to be non-escalatory, but we need to be extremely clear that if Russia does come across and try to impact NATO's security, that we will defend allies and we will have an Article 5 response.
And James, has our confidence or your confidence in the ability to send signals that we understand how they'll be received in Moscow changed at all in the past couple of weeks? I know NATO and Russia have been signaling to each other for a long time, many decades, but I'd be interested to hear whether the past 2 weeks have changed your confidence that Russia knows what messages we're trying to send and interprets them the way we intend for them to be interpreted.
Yeah, that's one of the many million-dollar questions we have right now. What is getting through and who is listening? And so I think that, you know, we certainly are obviously trying to signal to the Russian leadership, but also signal to the Russian people. You know, we've also been trying to explain to them that this is a war of choice, and also it's just crazy. I mean, the Ukrainian people, again, I don't want to get into the Russia analysis, but they're brothers, right? They're brothers to the Russian people. There's almost no Russian family that doesn't have some connection to, you know, a Ukrainian family member, and so it's clearly got to just be a staggering blow to the psyche of the Russian people. So we're trying to sort of signal that as well. We are also trying to make sure that military to military channels of communication are open. Even in periods of high tension and conflict, we need to be able to talk military to military to ensure that accidents that happen do not escalate and that there's absolute clarity. And so we are doing our very best to try and make sure that our top military commanders are speaking to their Russian counterparts to ensure that there's no accident. I mean, there's so much hardware moving around right now. We've seen, I mean, many hundreds of ballistic missile launches in the past week, and it's extremely dangerous situation right now. And so we've got to make sure that we keep those channels open. We're certainly calling on the Russian colleagues to make sure that they at least keep those open, even if the diplomatic channels have largely been shut off.
And in terms of Russian signaling towards NATO, I guess the President Putin's nuclear announcement from last weekend was some sort of signal. I'd be interested to hear as well whether you think Russia's signaling has changed in terms of its character in the war, or are we seeing signals that we probably would have expected to see in this type of situation?
Yeah, I think that, you know, without getting into too detailed an analysis of what Putin said over the weekend, I think we were very clear. Putin's signaling on the nuclear issue is, to be honest, is more coming from a position of weakness rather than a position of strength. It's clear that there's great frustration that their plan, their long designed, long thought out plan is not going according to plan. NATO has made a very conscious effort or made a very conscious decision not to escalate our rhetoric on nuclear issues the way the Russian side did, because it's unnecessary. It lowers the threshold for use, and we're not going to go there because it's just not on the table. And we also don't want to feed into the narrative which Putin is trying to create that NATO is the enemy here. You know, and that somehow he's fighting this holy war to save Russia from a NATO invasion. So we're not going to feed him with that. In terms of how the Russian messaging has changed, I don't know that we've really seen it. I mean, we still hear them say the same things. We had one dialogue with them where, you know, we said, well, what's your end game here? What are you trying to achieve? And they said, well, we're trying to ensure that Russian-speaking members of Ukraine, like Russian-speaking people of Ukraine, are safe. And then we said, okay, but what about indiscriminate attacks on Kharkiv? It's an entirely Russian-speaking city, and you're killing civilians there. And they had no answer to that question. So the signaling is also a bit confused, even on the Russian side right now.
In terms of Russia's performance in the war, it seems like on the Russian side, they're disappointed relative to their expectations from a week or so ago. Does that change how NATO thinks about Russia at all, either in the short term or also thinking over a decade-long time horizon, looking at how Russia has waged this war over the past 8 days?
Yeah, I mean, anytime that you have a use of force, both you and your adversaries will do a thorough analysis. I mean, I certainly think that, for instance, when the United States used force in Iraq or when NATO used force in Libya, there were clear lessons learned drawn from that and analysis. And I think it's a little bit too early for NATO to draw any conclusions or lessons learned. I think the thing that we're worried about, and again, as I said, this has come out, is the clear change in Russian tactics between the first 7 days of the war, where they were clearly trying to use special forces. They believed that they would be welcomed as liberators. They thought that Ukrainian forces and the Ukrainian government were going to just collapse, and that this would be quick and easy, and they could do it lightly with special forces. The real concern, as I said now, is that has clearly been frustrated. That has not gone according to plan. But what we're seeing now is moving up types of forces and types of equipment that can only be used indiscriminately. There's no smart weapons that are being brought up now into Ukraine. It's only things that are going to cause indiscriminate killing of civilians. And it's a real concern because so far, at least, we have seen civilian casualties, but not on the scale of, for instance, of what we saw with Russian tactics in Syria, where there was indiscriminate bombing of population centers. And so that's, I think, also why we're really quite worried about this change in dynamic over the last day or two.
Excellent. Well, we've gotten lots of questions coming in, so maybe I'll pull some questions from the audience. Let me call on Nicholas Ott first. Nicholas.
Hi, James, good to see you again. Fletcher F16, I'm greeting you from downtown Brussels, so not too far. Now with the Microsoft cybersecurity team, before that with the OSC in Vienna. No worries, I won't ask you about Russian misinformation or technical considerations about cybersecurity issues, but rather bring it back to sort of your core work here, also on partnerships and sort of the diplomatic surroundings. I was curious about two things. One, you mentioned all the off-ramps that NATO and the European Union has offered to Putin. None of them really worked, apparently. But what now? I mean, where is the political off-ramp for him to leave this gracefully, not having to worry that he's going to be cut off from his own leadership or people around him, and at the same time finding sort of an agreement that is also acceptable to Ukraine. And then the other piece, in light of sort of the EU-NATO cooperation, this is I hate to be cynical here, but this is a great opportunity for you and your colleagues to really lock in some gains while you're working on the strategic concept and the strategic compass on the EU side. What are your thoughts on that in terms of making sure that also the EU-NATO statement might actually sort of benefit from this increased momentum around European security? Thanks.
Thanks very much. Chris, do you want me to go ahead and start with that one?
Yep, that sounds great.
Okay, thanks. In terms of off-ramps, if you have any, let me know. I mean, honestly, that is what everybody in the entire world is trying to figure out right now. How do we influence the calculus of the Russian leadership? Because we can see this disaster unfolding in front of us. I think that we've taken a very important step in terms of the sanctions. I do think that it's very clear that the sanctions are much tougher and much more widespread than the Russian leadership anticipated. They had a very clear belief that they had sanction-proofed their regime. It doesn't mean that they can't hold out for longer, but I think it's hit a lot harder and a lot wider than they expected. I also sincerely hope that when they take a look at the fact that 141 countries voted in the UN General Assembly yesterday, including many countries where Russia has a pretty deep relationship, this is not something that they will get international support for. They will be international pariahs for the foreseeable future until they find a graceful way out of this. But it's a little bit hard, and it gets to some of the discussion we've seen about how much information is getting into the Russian leadership, how much influence do different groups in the Russian power structure have, and I'm certainly sure that the Fletcher professors talked about that quite a lot yesterday. In terms of NATO-EU cooperation, sadly, never miss the opportunity of a good crisis. So the NATO-EU cooperation is a lot better at the working level than you would think at the political level. And so in terms of things like stratcoms, humanitarian assistance, analysis and sharing of intelligence, it actually goes pretty well already. We have many of the groups here at NATO who are in daily contact with their EU counterparts to try and make sure we deconflict and work together. As you said, it's an important opportunity. You know, the EU strategic compass is coming up. The NATO strategic concept will be approved at our summit in Madrid. It's important that those two documents are in lockstep with each other. And I certainly think that we've received a great deal of clarity because of this conflict about where the I guess the added value of the organizations are, and where it makes most sense for us to coordinate and cooperate with each other. So it's certainly, the structures were there already, but fortunately we've been able to ramp them up quite quickly. And one area that I can say works probably the most effectively is the countering disinformation. Those two teams, the NATO and EU teams, are basically locked at the hip in terms of trying to push back against Russian disinformation. Thanks, Nicholas. It's good to see you.
Well, I'll encourage anyone who wants to ask a question directly to raise your hand on the Zoom function. We have lots of questions in chat, so I'll pick up one of those right now and put it to you, James. The question from Kathy is whether NATO's decision not to intervene militarily in Ukraine is binding on all NATO members, or whether one member state might choose to involve itself in the war directly.
Very tough question. I would certainly say that so NATO's membership is not binding on anyone. In other words, they are sovereign states. So NATO does not order any allies. But I certainly think that were an ally considering any type of action or activity, they would talk about it with their fellow allies, because the Article 5 guarantee that we have, it's incumbent upon consultation is incumbent upon the allies. So I think that we have. Yeah, NATO can't order an ally to do something or not do something. They remain sovereign states, but I don't think any action would be taken without a very serious and close consultation with the other allies.
And we've gotten a couple of questions on cyber issues as it relate to the war. And I guess, James, one of the, I think, interesting results of the past week is how there haven't been any big publicly reported cyber attacks as part of the start of the war. So I'd be interested in any reactions you have on why that might be.
Yeah, I mean, only so much I can say in an open format, but certainly I think everyone's a bit surprised that we haven't seen more cyber operations, at least outside of Ukraine. I think it's very clear that Ukraine, from the day before, well, even a couple weeks before, but then certainly in the 12 hours leading up to the conflict, Ukraine has been under an enormous cyber attack across all of their systems. Maybe it is just that the Russian hackers and all of their government supported services are focused on the Ukrainian systems right now. But you're right, we haven't seen a larger impact. Certainly as part of our ramp up to defend and deter, or deter and defend, NATO pushed a number of warnings out to our allies regarding the hardening of their own systems. One of the big things that we've actually changed in NATO over recent years is that not only have we identified standards for national resilience that we expect members to live up to, but we actually set resilience targets for allies now, just as we set defense capability targets for them. You must provide X number of troops and X number of armor and planes. We now also clearly say, as a NATO ally, we expect you to be able to have X and Y and Z in terms of levels of resilience. And so certainly as we saw the conflict coming, we put out a number of warnings and we increased the alert level across many of those areas to make sure allies hardened their systems. So I can't necessarily say that that's been a success, because maybe the targeting just hasn't been on NATO allies yet. And we're still in the very early stages of this, but certainly so far we've not seen some of what we expected.
Great. Let me bring in Ted Hack for a question. Ted?
Thanks. Sort of got to it, and my question on cyber was both macro and micro, because I'm on the board of a biotech company in Montpellier, Belgium. So I was a little concerned, given the collateral damage of cyber. You don't have to be directly attacked and the Russians have a very relaxed moral view towards collateral damage, as we've seen. If I think you've answered the question, but it's this: going forward, would you expect, once Ukraine gets to some level of stability, that more attacks on NATO, EU institutions, other are going to appear. So I take your point that maybe their hands are full at the moment, but it just seems like such a big fat target that's not being exploited. So I'm a bit concerned there.
Yeah, I mean, the real question there is, you know, what is our level of vulnerability? So, I mean, almost nobody knows. I think, though, that I would say that certainly NATO and EU have improved their capacity quite a lot to be able to work together to try and identify vulnerabilities and to head them off. One of the more interesting developments we have over the past couple of years is something called the Malware information sharing platform, where actually private sector and allies and EU member states all come together, and it's real time. You know, as soon as something's identified in the wild, it's immediately put in, and we talk about sort of which systems are affected, and so it's a really good information sharing platform to try and make sure people are protected. I do think, though, that we need to be, you know, like I said, we're in the early stages. We'll see where we go. Allies have been very clear, though, that cyber attacks could be considered an attack on NATO. And so, you know, we will not remain passive as we're attacked. So that's something that's entered into NATO doctrine because we have a clear recognition that attacks on cyber attacks can have not only damage on our information systems or our banking infrastructure, but can have real world impacts in terms of energy supply and things of that nature. So, you know, we'll see. But I think at this point, if people haven't gotten the message that they need to harden their systems and be ready, that, you know, they're never going to get that message. So thanks.
I appreciate the response. Thanks very much.
Well, James, one follow-up if I can. I guess in your answer, there was, you know, one potential answer is that we've gotten better at defending from cyber attacks, but there's also a sort of cyber deterrence part of the answer that could also be present. Maybe the answer is we don't know yet, but if you had to say more of one or more of the other, how would you speculate at this point? I guess cyber deterrence is hard to test because you don't really, like all deterrence, you don't really know when it's working.
Yeah, I'm way out on a limb here. I am not a cyber expert. And of course, the moment that I say anything, there's going to be a massive cyber attack tomorrow, right? Which is is going to change things. So, I mean, yeah, obviously it's a balance, right? There's a hardening, but then there's also a deterrence aspect to it. And we certainly have done our best to try and ensure both in the most recent period. And we'll see where it goes. But it's... Russia just needs to understand, and the leadership of Russia needs to understand that the costs will continue to increase. That's the only way we change their calculus right now. You know, we've imposed costs, those costs and that isolation, and if they start to use new types of attacks against us, that we need to increase the costs further. So sorry, my light here has turned off for just a second. I'm still here, but I'm just going to go turn the light system on. So I'm after hours. So hold on one second. Sorry.
Sounds good.
I can guarantee you that was not a Russian cyber attack. So that's NATO's energy saving. I didn't move around. I didn't move around quite enough. I'm sitting still in front of the computer, so the system thought the room was empty. So
excellent. Well, let me bring in another question from Mia. Mia, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you, Professor Miller. This is Mia Domowski. I'm from the Fletcher class of 2018. My question is about, rather than what Russia's red lines are, what are NATO's red lines, and how can NATO be proactive in signaling to Russia? We have seen evidence of Russia moving in thermobaric weapons. There's concern that they could be used in subways. I'm looking at Kyiv in particular. We also have no guarantees from Russia that Russia is not going to use nuclear missiles on Ukraine or somehow attack nuclear power plants in Ukraine. We know that Chernobyl has been captured by the Russians. So yes, so how can NATO be more proactive, and also do you think NATO can and should draw red lines?
Thanks very much, Mia. A good question, another really tough one. I think at this point, what we need to do is we need to activate any and all international fora that deal with these types of things to make extremely clear, and whether it's the Conference on the Chemical Weapons Convention, whether it's the nuclear non-use, whatever we have in terms of structures, we need to ensure that we are calling those meetings, we're discussing those meetings, and we're sending very clear messages, not from NATO, but from the international community. That these are red lines, because they're not NATO red lines, right? They're international community red lines. And so, we need to be extremely clear. And as I said, the message we got from the UN General Assembly yesterday was quite surprising at sort of the how many countries supported the resolution. So it's a really, really difficult thing to sort of say. I think, but sort of what are NATO's red lines? But I think that it's as I said, less about NATO's red lines and more about the international community's red lines. International humanitarian law has advanced quite far. I'm really pleased to see that the International Criminal Court has already said that it's beginning to look into possible war crimes and crimes against humanity. So I think those are important things, again, to try and signal that those who are killing civilians indiscriminately and using weapons for which are not for which are not proportional in terms of the warfare, there will be accountability. But we're in a really, really tough situation here on that. So you've asked a really tough question, Mia.
James, we've had a couple of questions in the chat about how this impacts other regions of the world. So let me start with India, since there are a couple of questions about India, which abstained from the UN vote yesterday. Can you comment on how NATO perceives this and what impact it has on NATO's relationship with India?
Well, it's certainly something, how a country voted or not voted. There were also a number of countries who seemed that they were maybe in the restroom when the voting went on. So there wasn't a vote no, it wasn't an abstention, but they just happened to not be in the room when the voting happened. And I think certainly in our dialogue with all of these countries, we're going to be raising that. Many of these countries want to have cooperation with NATO and want to work with NATO to build up their defense and security forces. But if we see that countries are not really that strong in terms of supporting international norms and standards and upholding international law and the UN Charter, it makes it a lot harder for us to work with them at the practical level. Doesn't mean we're going to cut off political dialogue, because political dialogue is always really important. But there's, NATO runs about 2,000 training activities every year on defense and security issues, and we train a huge number of UN peacekeepers, not just NATO forces, but forces that then go into UN or EU operations. And I think there will be some interesting conversations. Now, in terms of India specifically, we really only have a political relationship with India, so we have no practical cooperation with India. I think we'll need, certainly India's vote was its sovereign right to choose on that, but we'll have to sort of take account of that in terms of our dialogue with them going forward.
When the same question is also raised vis-a-vis China, and of course NATO is talking a lot more about China over the past couple of months. So perhaps looking forward, now that the security situation in Europe has changed so drastically, how do you expect this will shape or impact how NATO thinks about China, or even whether NATO thinks as much about China?
Well, we don't have a choice, right? We have to think about China. It's a growing world power, and it also, if it wants to be a norm setter and a respected member of the international community, it also certainly has some obligations here in terms of doing its part to uphold the rules-based international order and support the UN Charter. So that will certainly be a subject of conversation. Actually, it already has been a subject of conversation with our Chinese interlocutors. So we will continue to try and press on them also to be more proactive on this, to use the dialogue and relationship they have with Russia in order to try and press for a cessation of hostilities and a stop to indiscriminate killing. And so, we will be there. But in terms of, I know your question you're trying to get at, does this mean that NATO is now back to totally focusing on European security? The point is, we don't have a choice, right? If we look at some of the challenges we face to global security, if we're talking about cyber, if we're talking about missile and nuclear weapons proliferation, if we're talking about, challenges to the rules-based international order and freedom of navigation, those are global challenges that we face, and we can't afford to just do that. I mean, NATO will remain a Euro-Atlantic organization. There's no thought or idea that NATO would be a global organization, but we need to have global connections. We need to understand global security challenges, and we need to be able to speak to countries globally, both those who share our values and those who are sort of not aligned with our values, to try and improve the security for our alliance. So yeah, there will be a change, but I can't really sort of specify exactly what that's going to look like at this point.
Let me bring in two more questions from the audience. First, Mariella.
Hi, there we go. I wanted to thank you very much for what you've been sharing with us so far today. I wanted to understand a little bit more, if at all, gender perspectives and the Women, Peace and Security agenda have been incorporated in the analysis of what is going on, and more importantly, in terms of the solutions. For those who perhaps aren't aware, the Women, Peace and Security agenda, which is about 10 Security Council resolutions over the last 20 years, is really focused about, a conflict prevention strategy based on, recognizing that gender inequality is one of the root causes of conflict, but then also in the response to the conflict, making sure that the response doesn't exacerbate or reinforce gender inequality, because it just, keeps you in that loop. And I can't help but think that that analysis or that perspective is not being incorporated, generally speaking. And even some of the messages we hear and see in the media, that the men are being turned back if they try to flee, and that it's women and children who are, fleeing to other countries, even though 17–18% of the armed forces are women who have been trained in the Ukrainian security forces. Anyway, I could go on, and it's not my role to go on, but I just wonder, is it being discussed? Is it being incorporated into the thinking, into the solution space? So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks. We could have a whole other, and we should have a whole other discussion on the Women, Peace and Security, UN Security Council 1325. I will say that the NATO Secretary General Special Representative for Women, Peace and Security and Human Security actually sits just on the other side of the hallway from my office. So they are fully integrated into our teams here. And their job is to ensure that everything that we do is informed by the WPS agenda and the human security agenda. And so we've made huge strides, at least within NATO, in terms of that. So when we're thinking about those defensive plans that I mentioned, activation, when we're thinking about missions and operations that our NATO response force might need to undertake, all of those are informed by that perspective, and it's included in our operational planning and also included in our exercising and in the way our forces are built. So, that's something from a NATO standpoint. We've made huge strides there, largely driven by lessons learned from Afghanistan. It's just, we came to the very clear realization probably in 2005, 2006, that including the gender perspective and implementing 1325 in our plans and our work made our forces more effective. It helped us become more operationally effective. So it's a no-brainer. It's about operational effectiveness. Now, in terms of what the Ukrainians are doing and everything, obviously they're not a member of NATO and not subject to a lot of the norms and standards that NATO has. But I do think certainly as we go forward in this, we need to think about some of the lessons that we know in terms of including the widest possible range of voices in terms of trying to think about any peace settlement. If we think about sort of handling refugee flows and possible military assistance to civil authorities, all of that needs to be informed, again, by the WPS agenda and some of the lessons we've learned over the last couple of decades in implementing 1325. So it is a constant battle, and we're nowhere near where we need to be. But I think certainly, we've at least made some strides in how we think about that and how we implement it in practical terms. So thanks very much for the question.
Great. Let me bring in a question from Corinne as well. Corinne.
Hi, yes, thank you. I just, I wanted to ask a little bit about our war in Iraq and how Russia is using that rationalization to some extent justify their own invasion of the Ukraine. And I was wondering if you'd be willing to speak to how you see similarities or dissimilarities and basically how that history of ours is potentially coming back to bite us to some extent.
Yeah, that's probably for one of those Fletcher courses. What I will say is that it's not just the Iraq example that Russia is using, it's the Kosovo example, it's the Libya example, it's even the Afghanistan example. So, but I can't, and I apologize, I'm going to mess up the quote here, but it's, history repeats itself, but as comedy, and then it repeats itself again as farce. And so what we see is, Russia distorting the rationale and the reasoning, and also the fact that we've learned lessons from what happened in places like Iraq and the former Yugoslavia and Libya. I hope that we as an international community have advanced based on the lessons we've learned there. But clearly Russia is trying to use this. But I think, again, it's a screen, it's disinformation. And when you get right down to the core of it, okay, it's Putin and his regime could not live with a democratic, free Ukraine on their border because it set a terrible example for the Russian people as far as they were concerned. A Ukraine which is free, which makes its own choices, which can decide to join the European Union. Now, if Russia had made a good offer on the other side, Ukraine doesn't necessarily, it's not foregone conclusion that Ukraine goes to the West. It's about also Russia, could have made an interesting offer in terms of respecting sovereignty, sharing prosperity, reducing corruption, but that was not to be. And so Ukraine felt that its interests and the interests of its people were better served by aiming towards the goal of the West. And that really, at the end of the day, is the cause here. And Russia will try and distort everything that the West has done in the past. But and there's certainly room for criticism there. I'm not trying to say that. But I think that we need to sort of see through all of that and recognize it for what it is, which is, again, it's about regime preservation and democracy being a threat to this regime.
Thank you so much. And I just have a quick follow-up question to that. So I guess the concern is that if these countries, are sort of looking to the West, and they're basically the entire world is watching as Ukraine, is being bombed. If the United States and NATO, if they continue to have to tread such a delicate line and essentially sacrifice the Ukraine in terms of avoiding a nuclear war or active engagement with Russia, what kind of message does that send to these countries that are looking to our democratic ideals if they're seeing a country like the Ukraine, who's actively petitioned to join NATO, be sacrificed? I mean, I feel as though there's a moral, it's you know, it's hard to dispassionately discuss this situation when what's been very effective is the fact that Zelensky has been able to engage the world through social media and other channels. So there is, you know, it's not a dispassionate situation. It is certainly a very emotive situation for people watching, not to mention people who are, you know, suffering under these bombs.
James, given we only have 3 minutes left, let's make that the final question. And if you have any other final comments you want to wrap back into your answer, that would be great.
Sure, thanks. And Corinne, you know, it is a very, very good question that you ask. I think that we need to see how much this energizes the international community to stand up for these rights. I mean, we're not going to wave great power politics away because we don't want it to be such that, you know, large autocratic powers can attack smaller countries. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us to reinforce the international system to try and make sure that this doesn't happen again in the future. And I think the way that we do that is to impose real costs on the countries. And I think the only ground for hope that we have here, okay, is that Russia itself is now shocked by how integrated it is into the world economy, right? Russia is not North Korea. It is not Iran. It can't just cut itself off. And so I think even the leadership of Russia has been surprised by how connected it has been and how much the international community can reach out. I think there's also, and I'll be very honest, there is a very real challenge here with regard to nuclear proliferation. I mean, Russia has just violated the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, in which Russia, the United States, and the UK guaranteed the territorial integrity of Ukraine if it gave up its nuclear weapons. Ukraine was the third largest nuclear power in the world in 1994. And it gave up those nuclear weapons. And I think this is just one of the many challenges we're going to face in the coming period is how do we hold up the non-proliferation regime when countries see if you don't have nuclear weapons, you might get dismantled by an autocratic state next door to you. So I don't have a great question. I don't have a great answer to your question other than to say this is the work of our generation going forward. You know, we've got to reinforce the UN. We've got to reinforce all of the arms control treaties. We've got to think about emerging and disruptive technologies. How are we going to set norms and standards for them? How are we going to move towards arms control treaties on things like use of autonomous weapon systems and military activity in space? You know, hopefully this will be enough of a shock to the system that we will, in good faith, sort of jump into that. I have no doubt that Fletcher students everywhere across all generations will be contributing to that discussion. As I said, I've met enough of them over the years, either in national administrations or international organizations, to know that they are out there fighting the good fight. So really thank you for some really good, tight questions, and appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today.
Well, thank you, James, for joining us. We hope we can continue this conversation in the future with James, with other Fletcher alums at NATO. So thank you, everyone, for joining. And thanks again, James, for taking the time.
Thanks. Have a good day.